Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you. Can you hear me? I hope so. I'm going to project my slides to support that presentation. I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon to talk about how can we empower students as global citizens. And I'm going to use a few slides just to support my presentation. So I'm going to divide this presentation in 5 sections. One, how empowering is education? How do we make a curriculum empowering? How do we make an empowering curriculum effective? How do we help teachers support a more effective curriculum? And lastly, how do we make sure that systems are coherently aligned behind the vision of empowering students as global citizens? So let me begin with how empowering is education.
Recording in progress.
There is very good research spanning many decades that shows that when education is authentic, there is very good research spanning many decades that shows that when education is authentic, relevant, and meaningful to students, it is more empowering. And what does that mean? It means that students understand the purpose of what they're learning. Why are they learning what they're learning? In my classes at Harvard, I begin every lecture asking the question, why is this content that we're going to cover important to me? Why does it matter to the world? And I conclude every class asking students the same questions. Why is this important to you? Why does it matter to the world? The reason it's important for students to see that connection is because when that is evident, that activates the intrinsic motivation to learn. There is nothing more disheartening than to see students going through the motions of covering content for which they don't see the purpose. They can't answer the question, why am I learning this? So let me give you an example. Some years ago, I conducted a study of a civic education curriculum implemented in high poverty areas in Mexico. And the curriculum was very simple. Over an entire year, students were invited to identify a problem that they wanted to solve in their community or in their school. And they basically worked together to identify the root cause of the problem and a possible way to solve the problem. And then they went ahead and implemented the solution. I did an impact evaluation of that curriculum, but I'll just give you one example. In one of the schools participating in this problem, the students focused on the need to have clean water in the school. And they figured out the school had latrines, but it didn't have clean water. And among the options that they considered, they realized that not too far from the school was a house that had a well, a water well. And so they talked to the owner of a house and they asked her if she would give permission to extract water 1 hour every day to bring clean water to the school. They raised funds to get a water pumped, they created a system of hoses, and they brought water to the school. I asked the students, why did you choose that problem? And they said, because to us, water is not just about water. It's about the rights of all the students to have an education. See, they said nobody wants to come to a school where the latrines have no water, but especially for girls at an age where they have their period. If there is no water in the school, they simply will not come. And if a girl misses class for 3, 4, 5 days every month, they're going to miss the school year. So to us, water is about the opportunity to learn, about the right to learn. And I thought to myself, what a phenomenal thing that a 15, 16-year-old can learn at that age that they can focus on problems that they are considered meaningful, and they can join forces with others in finding a solution to a problem. That's what I mean by an education that is empowering. Now, I would ask you to reflect on the schools that you know, at the level at which students at the age of 15 or 16 are in school, which in most places is secondary school. To what extent is the education system in a country that you're working actually offering an education that is empowering in that way, that is authentic and that is relevant? I can tell you using cross-national evidence based on reports of students and teachers around the world that much education is actually not very empowering. Using data from the PISA study that you know, that study asks students, how satisfied are you with your life? And the responses that you see here range on the right-hand side from 87% of the students who find that they're happy with their lives, to at the other end, in Brunei, Darussalam, or in Turkey, only 40% of the students are satisfied with their lives. And so obviously, if at the age of 15, students are not happy with their lives, there's something missing in the education that they are receiving. And I think this is part of what is missing. The same survey asks students, to what extent do you think your life has meaning, has a purpose, which is one of the components of having agency. And again, you see that the responses similarly vary from over 90% in Indonesia to under 60, around 50% in the United Kingdom. So why do you think that's the case? Why do you think that students at the age of 15 who are in school would find that their life has no purpose and would find unhappy with their lives? I think some of that has to do with the education they experience. The TALIS survey, which asked representative samples of teachers around the world, how do they teach, presents a very interesting picture. Most teachers are very good at implementing what we would call teacher-centered instruction, at being the sage on the stage. They're not so good at providing their students opportunities to solve problems, such as the example I just provided in Mexico, where the students decided what problems to solve and went about solving them with the support of their teachers. Let me give you an example. When teachers are asked, when you teach, do you present a summary of the content that was recently learned? Most teachers do that, which is a phenomenal thing. It's very helpful to explain how is what you're learning, what are you going to learn? Do you show students, do you explain to students what the goals are for instruction? And again, most teachers also do that, which is very good. Do you explain to teachers what you expect them to learn? Again, most teachers around the world do that. That shows that there is remarkable uniformity around the world around these basic ideas of what good teacher-centered instruction looks like. Do you explain to your students how new and old topics are related? Again, most teachers around the world do that. But when it comes to student-centered learning, the situation changes dramatically. When teachers are asked, do you give your students a task for which there is no obvious solution, such as the task of how are you going to bring water to the school? You realize that the percentage of teachers that do that drops dramatically. It's very high in Vietnam and in Portugal, close to 70%, and in Colombia. But look at the other end on the right-hand side, the Czech Republic, Austria, Lithuania, Japan, just about 10%, 15% of the students, of the teachers, present their students with tasks for which there is no obvious solution. Similarly, do you give your students tasks that require your students to think critically? Again, much wider variation around the world than with respect to teacher-centered instruction. Do you have your students work in small groups to solve a problem? Again, wide variation. In some countries, very small percentage of teachers do that. Do you have your students to decide on their own how to solve a problem? Similarly, wide variation. Do you give your students problems that require at least a week to complete? Same. I mean, imagine the problem of bringing water to that school in Mexico. That took months to solve. The students had to find the problem. They had to negotiate with the owner of the water well access to the water. They had to raise funds to get the water pump going and the system of hoses. They had to install it. So that's not the experience of most students. So I think that's part of the obvious answer of what is an empowering curriculum. It's a curriculum that engages students in setting goals for their own learning, in connecting those goals to real problems in their schools, in their communities, and in giving them the opportunity to collaborate with others in achieving those goals. So how do we make a curriculum empowering? I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. Some years ago, I did an evaluation very similar to the evaluation of the civic education program in Mexico of a program in the Middle East called the INJAS program, a program that basically teaches high school students how to create a company. And what I studied in that program was to what extent were students who basically work with others under the supervision of a mentor in creating a company, and in the 6 countries that you see here, to what extent that helped them develop knowledge, and skills. So basically, you probably have heard about the company program. You see here Soraya Salti, who was a Jordanian entrepreneur that brought this program to scale around the world. And basically, that program, through a system of tier competitions, engages students in creating a company. They decide what company. I'll give you one example. When I conducted this study, I observed one of the winners of the competition was a group of students from Oman. And the problem that they had focused on was the problem of literacy, just like the students in Mexico had focused on the problem of water in the school. In their case, they said, we're very concerned about the fact that in Oman, boys finish high school at much lower rates than girls. And of course, that creates all kinds of challenges in the society. The fact that boys are, on average, less educated than boys are. And so we decided to solve that problem. And we went to the local university to, forget, I think it's called the, forget right now. And we talked to professors in the faculties of education and psychology. And they said the root causes of this problem are in early literacy. And so they said, why is it? They said, some boys don't really learn how to read, how to engage with the printed world proficiently, with deep understanding, with love for reading. And of course, it's very difficult to complete your education if you're a poor reader. And so they basically talked to the teachers and they said, how can this problem be solved? They said, it's very important to begin to engage students with literacy, with books, even before they go to school. But there isn't much literature for children in Oman, published in Arabic. So they created a company that published books for little children so that parents could read to them even before they knew how to speak. Again, as with the example of Mexico, how empowering is this? Well, let me show you some of the findings of my study, in which I examined in 6 countries the difference that being exposed to this training made before and after, and I also had comparison groups. I'm only going to show you the differences before and after. So one of the dimensions that I measure is, do students learn some basic concepts related to building a company? Like, what does it mean to sell shares in a company? What is the vision for a company? What is marketing? What is the process of liquidation of a company? What is a company? And of course, as you would expect, students who go through this process learn those things. So there's nothing surprising about that. It's a fairly consistent finding across countries. What is more surprising is that the experience of creating the company helps the students gain competencies that transfer beyond the idea of a company. For example, I ask students a series of questions that measure what we would call self-efficacy, but also self-knowledge, self-management, and social skills. So for example, look at the question, to what extent do you believe that you will be able to achieve your goals in the future? And what you will see is that in all countries, after participating in this program, which lasted only 12 weeks, the percentage of students who believed that they could achieve their goals had increased. Similarly, when students were asked, to what extent do you think it is important to set goals for yourself? The percentage of students who believed that increased after participating in this program in all countries that participated in the study. Similarly, with the question, to what extent do you think you can learn from your failures? To what extent are challenges opportunities? To what extent can you learn outside the school? How important is education to you? How important do you think negotiation is to solve problems? How much confidence do you have in your own leadership skills? On balance, on average, in all these countries, there were improvements in those indicators. Similarly, when students were asked, to what extent do you think your capacity to work in teams has increased? Or are you proficient in working in teams? Can you adapt to new situations? Can you solve problems? Are you confident making presentations in front of your peers? Are you confident making presentations in front of adults? Do you think you have the skills to resolve differences? Do you think that you can solve problems? Are you able to persuade others? On balance, and in most of these indicators, there is an improvement. Not in all indicators and not in all countries, but the preponderance of the evidence is that that percentage increase after 3 months of participation in a program that basically helps students learn how to create a company. Similarly, when students were asked, to what extent do you think you have the skills to negotiate a conflict, to compete for a job, to begin a business? Do you understand the role of business in society? Can you lead teams? Are you able to do research? Can you learn from real world experiences? Again, in most countries, we see improvements before and after participating in that program. So I think that answers the question that we actually do know how to provide students experiences such as the ones that I described in Mexico, where students were able to identify a problem they care about and work with others in solving it, or such as the experiences of the students in the countries in the Middle East that learned to create a company. Now, I think that the Sustainable Development Goals are a wonderful window to create pedagogical experiences and to design curriculum that will be empowering to our students. And this is totally consistent with two recent reports on the futures of education. The OECD Learning Compass, every 10 or 15 years, the OECD and UNESCO independently produce these frameworks that basically look at trends around the world and develop provocations, ideas to stimulate educators around the world in terms of how to better prepare students for the challenges of the future. So the Learning Compass of the OECD, or the report published a couple of years ago by UNESCO's Commission on the Futures of Education, Reimagining Our Futures Together, a commission of which in which I had the privilege of serving. I was a member, really have very much overlapping ideas. So from the learning competencies, from the learning compass of the OECD, it's saying what is really critical is to, of course, we have to develop core foundations, but we also, it's very important to develop transformative competencies, the competencies that would allow students to see themselves as agents with the capacity to advance a better world, the world as described in the Sustainable Development Goals. And to do that, it's essential that students have agency, that they have the belief that they can make a difference, and co-agency, that they have the belief and the skills to collaborate with others in achieving goals. Of course, they need to have knowledge, they need to have schools, we need to cultivate attitudes and values, and we also need to develop the capacity for reflective practice, the capacity for students to anticipate the future, to take action, to reflect, and then go back and anticipate. So this is a much wider set of competencies than simply transmitting competencies. Now, making this into a curriculum is actually simpler than may appear. And that's part of what I have been doing with my colleagues over the last decade. I have been studying reforms around the world to transform curriculum and to support teachers in line with these aspirations. So here are some of our publications. Most of the ones that you see here are open access books. You can download them for free if you just Google those titles, and you will get to a website where you can download these. And many of these have been translated and published in Arabic by the Arab Bureau for Education in the Gulf States, based in Saudi Arabia. So I'm sure you can find copies of these reports in Arabic as well. What did we learn from these reforms about how to make the curriculum more ambitious, more audacious, more capacious? Well, the first thing we learn is that curriculum is incredibly important. If you want to transform instruction, you need to have clear goals about what are the skills that you want students to gain and how those align with a better future. And I've just suggested that visions such as the Sustainable Development Goals provide a framework, provide a compass to orient that enterprise. But curriculum is not self-executing. We cannot just write a curriculum and wave a magic wand and say, let's do it. Teachers internalize that curriculum through what they know, through the mental models that they have. An ambitious curriculum requires more than working with individual teachers. It requires supporting schools over extended periods of time so that teams of teachers can themselves engage in this process of anticipation, action, reflection, and so on. And so there are three challenges in terms of supporting these more ambitious goals that need to be addressed. The first one is to have a curriculum that is well designed, that is effective, that is within reach for teachers, that is coherent. we also then need to build the capacity of teachers to implement that curriculum, and we need to make sure that this is coherent. And that's what I'm going to refer to. Beginning with coherence, beginning with a well-designed curriculum. Any curriculum is built on two hypotheses. The hypothesis that if I teach A, my students will learn B or whatever, right? If I teach fractions, my students will learn fractions. If I teach division, my students will learn how to divide. That's hypothesis A. Hypothesis B is that if my students learn what I expect them to learn, the consequences for themselves, for their communities, will be X, Y, and Z, right? If I create a demanding math curriculum that makes sure that my students know a lot of math, they will have great opportunities to partake in careers related to STEM, which are going to improve their earning power, for example. Or if I teach my students empathy and the capacity to see the world through the eyes of others, they will be more likely to be capable of cooperating with others, and that will lead to societies in which people can collaborate to advance the common good, right? But those hypotheses may not always be right. And so let me give you an example. One of the areas in which I have been working for the last several years, I'm right now working on a book on the subject, is education and climate change. How do we educate students to understand climate change and to see themselves as agents with the capacity, not just with the belief, but with the capacity to make a difference in climate change? So one of the things that I did in one of my books was to review existing evaluations of the effectiveness of climate change curriculum. And what I found, to my surprise, is that most curriculum actually succeed at teaching students the facts of climate change, at understanding the science, but they don't succeed at building agency. In fact, they may be counterproductive because they produce students who pretty much conclude that this is such a complicated issue that there is nothing they can do about it. However, in that review of existing research, where I reviewed scores of studies on different ways to educate students for climate change, I found the work of a particular Norwegian researcher, Maria Ojala, who did something very interesting. She conducted experiments in which she exposed students to two different ways to learn about climate change. One group of students learn a course on the science of climate change. The other group of students learned the same course, but in addition had an experience similar to the experience I described from my study of civic education in Mexico. Students were told, identify a challenge caused by climate change that you care about and see what could you do that would make a difference. And then she evaluated pretty much in the same way in which I evaluated that civic education program or the INJAS program in the 6 countries in the Middle East, whose findings I just reported. And what she found is that when you compare before and after, in terms of knowledge, both groups are very similar. They both learn the same facts, they learn the same science. But in terms of agency, in terms of beliefs in their own capacity, only the group that had participated in a project-based experience where they had the opportunity to do something about the problem actually increased the belief that they could do something, foundation of agency. Now, contrast that finding with the slides I showed you earlier based on results from the Tally study that shows that very few teachers, a very low percentage of teachers, give students the opportunity to themselves decide how to solve a problem, to collaborate with their peers on a challenging task, to work on a problem over an extended period of time. If you're curious about this research, this book is also an open access book. You can download it freely online, and it goes into more detail in what I have just described. So it's totally possible to design curriculum aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, and that's what I have been doing for some time now. And these are 3 curricula which I have developed with my collaborators in my lab on how to develop a curriculum aligned with climate change. The first work that we did is a curriculum called the World Course. It consists of 350 units. It's a comprehensive curriculum from kindergarten to high school, aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals and with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The second publication, Empowering Students to Improve the World in 60 Lessons, is a streamlined version of the same thing. And the third book, Learning to Collaborate for the Global Common Good, presents multiple curriculums, multiple pathways to achieve the same things. I'll go very quickly sharing with you the principles of the world course, of how we develop that curriculum. So we basically began with this vision of the graduate. What does a graduate of this curriculum look like? We built a curriculum that was completely project-based, relying on the kinds of experiences I have described here in Mexico and in the Middle East, where the emphasis was in getting students to work in teams, to engaging them in active learning. The idea was to cultivate not only knowledge, but skills and attitudes. And the entire year, the students were working on a project that culminated in a capstone, a coherent theme. The units were interdisciplinary. There was a lot of new content and knowledge. The idea was to foster the agency of the students, their ability and desire to make a difference. We basically help students learn from what works, but also from what is challenging. The goal was to develop an innovative and entrepreneurial spirit, making connections between the school and the community, engaging parents as resources. The emphasis was in developing higher order cognitive skills, right? Curiosity, exploration, observation, analysis. The focus were the global challenges as well as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We help students continuously make connections between local and global. We engage them with issues that are messy, that are complex, that have no easy answers. The curriculum, of course, at every grade was appropriate. We were teaching kindergartners and high school students in different way, but it was not infantilizing. The premise was that students are smart and capable of engaging with topics that are complex. Basically, we took students from personal and immediate experiences to more advanced and conceptual understanding. We basically, in building this profile of the graduate, we basically created three big categories of competencies. First one was intercultural competency, which had three domains: interpersonal, intrapersonal, and ethics. The second, knowledge and skills in various domains, call them disciplines, if you will: economics, culture, politics, science, technology, public health, demography, business entrepreneurship, and then work and mind habits. And then each one of these categories we subdivided into specific learning standards. We ended up with 180 learning standards. For example, the student is able to recognize and weigh diverse cultural perspectives. They can understand their own identity as well as the identities of others. They can work productively in and lead effectively intercultural teams. They can demonstrate empathy towards people from different origins. They can understand and appreciate cultural variation in basic rules of etiquette, and so on and so forth. So those three resources, which are easily available and also have been translated into Arabic by the Arab Bureau of Education in the Gulf states, will give you an example of how to do that. But one of the things that I learned in doing that work, as I mentioned earlier, is that curriculum is not self-executing. That just as important as having a well-designed curriculum is to build an effective system of supports to teachers, build capacity to enact that curriculum. And that's what this book does. This book basically includes a protocol to design and adapt a global citizenship curriculum, beginning with the Sustainable Development Goals, but also a protocol to design a school-wide strategy to build the capacity of teachers to advance global education. And then an example, a prototype. And so I want to stop on the basic process. It's basically a change management process through which a team of teachers in a school can together adapt a curriculum to their school and learn together how to do this better. So what are the basic steps? Well, we need to have a leadership team. That team needs to spend some time studying documents such as UNESCO's Futures of Education Vision or the Learning Compass or the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And from there, they need to develop a framework of what does the graduate look like? What are the learning standards that are going to guide that? And then they need to use those learning standards, that framework, to audit the existing curriculum. They need to identify where is there good alignment between what the curriculum is already trying to do and that more ambitious vision, and where are the gaps. And then based on that, they need to decide, okay, where are we going to begin? What is within reach? What's a prototype that we can try basically to engage in this cycle of anticipation, action, reflection, so we can go back again? Then, of course, they need to communicate that vision to everyone else in the school, and they need to enlist their support. And then they need to make a decision and figure out, okay, who's going to do what when, and when is this going to happen? They need to figure out what resources are necessary. Those resources may involve partnerships with organizations in the community, with local institutions. They develop a framework to monitor the implementation, and they need to build a professional, they need to communicate that strategy and build a professional development strategy. And then they need to have the courage to execute, and then evaluate, and then do it better the next time. But of course, it's not enough to go through one cycle or even one school in doing that. In trying to bring this work to scale, we have to think about creating coherence in systems. Education systems are complex systems that have multiple interlocking components, right? Curriculum, professional development, assessment, and it's important to make sure that those components are aligned. And this book, again, another open access publication you can download for free, also published in Arabic by the Arab Bureau and in many other languages, the Arab Bureau for Education in the Gulf states, also published by UNESCO's International Bureau of Education in French. You can find this in UNESCO's website and download it freely. Basically is about how do you bring that work to scale. And what the book offers, in addition to, of course, a conceptual foundation more extensive than the one I've had time to present here, are 5 perspectives to think about the process of educational change. And my argument is that educational change can be seen through at least 5 lenses. It can be seen as a cultural process of change, as a process of trying to change the culture of education, as a psychological process, a process of trying to help learners change how they see the world and their skills, as a professional process, a process trying to build the expertise of those who work in the system, as an institutional process, as a process of transforming institutions, and as a political process. And what I argue in the book and explain in that book is how when we embark on the task of seeing the process of advancing global citizenship education through these 5 lessons, we can be more effective, we can be more successful at transforming an education system. So just very briefly and to conclude, the process of educational change, of course, is about changing the culture of education. And culture to an institution, to a society, is like water to the fish. It's indispensable. Without it, the fish cannot swim, cannot live, but we don't see it. It's invisible, and that makes it much more powerful. But it is very important to be aware that in trying to change, for example, in trying to shift those teachers from teacher-centered instruction to student-centered instruction, that's a huge shift, a huge cultural shift. And so that requires, there are a lot of recommendations in the book about how to be sensitive to that reality and how to facilitate that reality. Similarly, an educational institution is embedded in other larger institutions. It interacts with other institutions, such as families. So schools cannot just pretend that they can change what happens in the school without thinking about how is this going to relate to the expectations that parents have, that others in the community have of what schools are supposed to do. A psychological perspective is largely about drawing on the vast body of knowledge from the field of psychology about how to produce change. The example I gave you earlier of the largely unsuccessful, maybe even counterproductive curricula in climate change are examples of how ignoring the science of learning can produce disappointing results. Because in fact, anybody who has read the first book on how to cultivate student agency and self-efficacy would know that you need to engage, you need to scaffold experiences for learners to build that confidence, and that's doable. But for the most part, it doesn't happen by having students sit in a desk and listening to somebody. You need experiences and you need feedback and you need opportunities to learn from that experience so you gain that competency. I mean, similarly with learning how to read, there is a whole science of literacy which using it is going to produce much more effective curricula than ignoring it. A professional perspective is about anchoring educational practice on expert-based knowledge. And so how do you do that? You basically intervene through creating norms, creating roles, building capacities, and so on. An institutional perspective is about understanding the systemic nature of educational institutions and making sure there is coherence and alignment among all the components of the pieces. And a political perspective is about understanding that the education system touches the vast majority of people in a society, and they all have hopes. They all have aspirations for what schools can do in society. And the most successful reforms are those who can listen and recognize those perspectives and build a broad base of support for reform. So those are the ideas I wanted to share with you on how to make education empowering for students. Recognizing that education can indeed be very empowering, and there are many examples of curricula around the world that do that already, that we can make a curriculum very effective and aligned with an ambitious and audacious vision for humanity and for students. But to do that, of course, we have to build the capacities of teachers to be able to enact that ambitious curriculum. And we also need to think about increasing the coherence of systems so that all components of the systems are aligned with that vision. Thank you very much. That's all I wanted to offer today.
Wow, that was incredible. I loved how Dr. Reimers talked about education shaping who we become, not just what we learn.
فعلا يا حسن، كلمته كانت عميقة جدا، جعلتنا نفكر بدورنا كجيل شاب وكيف من الممكن أن نكون مواطنين فاعلين ومسؤولين في العالم.
That's so true, Wafa. I think he really inspired all of us to take action. And a quick reminder for our viewers that instant interpretation is available in Arabic, English, and French, and it can be accessed by clicking the interpretation icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen.
وكتذكير للحضور، نود أن نعلمكم بأن الترجمة الفورية تتوفر بالعربية والإنجليزية والفرنسية بالإضافة إلى لغة الإشارة.